women in history I never heard of, and wouldn't be surprised if you haven't either. Today, let's talk about Frances Thompson. Frances Thompson was born around 1840 and passed away in 1876. And before I continue, this is your trigger warning. If any of these things will negatively affect you, it's time to move on. I'll never judge you for it. Frances was born into slavery. There's not a whole lot known about her childhood, but she said she was raised in Maryland. And the family who enslaved her, last name of Walker, indulged her. Kinda. She loved brightly colored dresses and most of the other things that other girls love, to the extent that she was allowed to. But she also had a disability due to a cancer she'd had in her foot. For most of her life, it left her dependent on crutches just to walk. That's going to be important later. So at that time, there was a civil war. We'll call it the first one. Anyway, the Walkers took her with them to Memphis. But once there, rebel forces took out the entire family except for her, quote, mistress. Well, circumstance dictated that Frances was a freed woman, and Memphis was a place where lots of freed people settled. It was a safe space for them. They built lives and incomes. There were several predominantly black neighborhoods. And from 1860 to 1862, the population quadrupled, from about 4,000 to about 16,000 people. It was also a place where Irish immigrants settled. That was due in no small part to the Great Famine occurring in Ireland. So in 1862, Frances was about 22 years old, independent, and living with her 16-year-old roommate, Lucy Smith. To support themselves, they offered laundry and sewing services out of their home. Frances lived frugally, except for the occasional splurge on a colorful dress. So back to the Irish immigrants. When they first came to the U.S., they were shunned, forced to the fringes of society. But by the time the Union defeated the Confederacy, Irish folks were rising to power. Mayor of Memphis and the majority of the police force. With the population growing so quickly, there was heavy competition for a limited number of jobs. And of course, Irish folks were worried that black folks would take all those jobs. Sound fucking familiar? They wanted black folks staying subservient. So, Irish officers used intimidation tactics, like banning black folks get-togethers in public altogether. And that's just one tame example. But folks continued celebrating their freedom. Why the fuck wouldn't they? But that pissed off the cops. So they would raid those get-togethers, beat people before arresting them. That's, again, just one example. I need you to keep this bit in mind. Black folks did not meet violence with violence. Instead, they went to the Freedmen's Bureau, following the proper channels. But white newspapers decided, peaceful schmeaceful, and they stirred that pot with zero evidence. I know, you're surprised. They reported a violent uprising was brewing. They called for white folks to get those, quote, black barbarians under control. You should assume that means back on the plantation. Well, by April of 1866, President Andrew Johnson wanted to rebuild the country. He promised to help poor white folks and flat out ignored petitions from black people, which of course encouraged Southerners to double down, because now they had a buddy at the top level of government. You see where this is going, right? So that same month, a large number of black Union soldiers were discharged. They headed to Memphis and their families. Happy reunion, right? Yeah, except on May 1st, 1866, there was a street fight between those soldiers and the Irish cops. Of course, white folks blamed black folks. They were the violent ones. Yeah, except it was Irish and other white folks who were behind the vicious attacks. And for 40 hours, those white people rioted. Around 1 a.m., there was a knock at Frances and Lucy's door. 7 dogs pretending to be men. They demanded that Frances make them something to eat. She was terrified, so she whipped up biscuits and coffee. And as soon as their little tum-tums were full, they demanded that Frances and Lucy service them in another way. Both of them said that's not how we make our living. But then, the men pulled out their pistols. And for 4 hours, all 7 repeatedly beat and both the woman and the teenager. No, 16 is not a woman. When they were finished, they stole dresses, quilts, and all the money that Frances had managed to save. About $100 then. The modern equivalent is about $3,000. Oh, and they also destroyed the rest of the food that was in the house. Afterward, Frances was sick, bedridden. She was convinced she was going to pass away. Lucy struggled to speak for 2 weeks. The men had choked her so viciously that her throat was severely swollen. Before order was restored, 46 black people had been unalived. 75 others were wounded by gunfire. More women used, and properties were destroyed, including the homes of 91 families. Today, it's known as the Memphis Massacre, and my summary barely scratches the surface. Frances told her story, but of course the men who'd done it and the men who supported those men didn't believe her. Some people who heard the stories claimed to be horrified, and yet rioters never suffered a consequence. You're surprised, right? You better not be. Now, at that same time, the 14th Amendment was being heavily debated. It was going to grant citizenship to Black folks. Surprisingly enough, Frances, Lucy, and about 170 other Black folks were allowed to testify in front of Congress about what happened that day. Frances and Lucy testified that 2 of the men who'd come a-callin' that night were cops. Surprised again, aren't you? It's believed that their testimony was one of the things that destroyed public opinion about the douche canoe in charge. It's also believed the testimony was a major contributor to the successful passing of the 14th and 15th Amendments. That testimony also made Frances one of the first Black women to publicly condemn what white men do. Afterward, she tried to go back to her previous life. That didn't mean that life was quiet. Lots of white folks were desperate to discredit her. She was arrested multiple times with evidence that was not evidence, if you catch my meaning. And 10 years later, at the beginning of 1876, police got a tip. Shortly after, Frances was arrested again. The charge? Cross-dressing. She was forced to endure repeated medical exams. And yeah, it was discovered that Frances had been born with a peener. She was further forced to pose for 2 mugshots. One as Frank, as they insisted on calling her, in men's clothing, of course. The other as herself in women's clothing that were not her own. Authorities officially had their angle, because in their opinion, a man can't possibly be. Newspapers reprinted her testimony, calling for it to be stricken from the record. They claimed she ran a brothel. She didn't. They weaponized her deceit. They wanted all the survivors' testimony thrown out, so Frances was forced into men's clothing, despite that she was a woman and had lived as such for her entire life. Newspapers only called her Frank. Well, unless they were calling her Crutchy. At her sentencing, she was ordered to pay a fine for which she had no money. Remember the 7 fucking dogs. So instead, she was sentenced to 100 days on a chain gang, where she suffered repeated abuse and... Remember I said she couldn't walk without help? How do you think she did on the chain gang? Crowds of white folks would gather every day, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman they insisted was a man. To avoid the chaos that may allow another inmate to escape, Frances was taken back to the jail and served out the remainder of her sentence there, where again she suffered repeated abuse and... Upon release, she moved to a cabin in North Memphis. But unfortunately, over the next several weeks, she grew more and more ill. And near the end of 1876, Frances Thompson passed away from dysentery. Oh, and remember her testimony before Congress? That day, she became the first trans person to testify before a governing body. And regardless if they liked it, one quote said, she helped shape the path of Reconstruction. Today, her legacy should be one of hope, but plenty of people don't want you to know even her name, nor the names of the countless other trans people who have contributed significantly to history. But that is exactly why I'm telling you her story. Now, before I end, my thoughts, because it's my video. My heart is still breaking for Frances. But I'm curious, did your heart break for her? And if so, for how long? Were you rightfully outraged through the entire thing? Or did your sympathy and compassion turn to stone the moment I mentioned her peener? If it's that second one, I'm gonna need you to go to the dictionary and look up the definition of humanity. But I'm gonna give you a clue. Nothing in the definition mentions body parts. Now I want you to use your big brain and ask yourself a question. How did you become so arrogant as to treat humanity as conditional based on a body part? Now ask yourself a second question. And be brutally fucking honest with yourself. When you and your children are forced to endure medical exams, to prove what's down there, will you then finally admit just how fucked up it is to determine someone's worth based on what's in their pants? Fucking think about it.